councillor with Cheltenham Kings Parish Council, and some of you, hopefully most of you, will have heard of CK Futures, which is a Cheltenham Kings initiative. It was we came together as a response to the climate emergency declared by Cheltenham Borough Council in 2019, and we've been doing a series of events over the year, and this is actually going to be the last of the year. It is slightly different from some of the others that we've done. We've been focusing on electric vehicles and insulation and all the other things. And I'll talk a little bit more about this one in a minute and why this choice. But just to say, thank you again for coming. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping to start off with. You can tell I used to work in the corporate world, and you talk about housekeeping. If you can you keep your masks on? I'm sorry, I know this is, but given where we are and just making sure that most people, obviously if you're eating or drinking or speaking, that's fine. But just, just for the way things are. We've opened a window here. We're going to keep this door open over here as well to get a through draft. So that's okay. Obviously, we're not planning on anything happening, but if you needed, I know you've come all the way through here to get in, or most of you have. The exit to the street is straight out this way. You can go straight through there. We will be recording this event. It'll only be the panel. I'm standing here in front of Raechel because I want to be on screen here. But yes, it'll be mainly the panel who will be recorded. But obviously, if you've got a question, if you can speak up. What we will do is, as we say, we'll run this as I'll do a little bit of an introduction about why we're here today, ask a few questions, and I'll open it up to the room. We've got teas and coffees. Please help yourself as well, and that's what it's there for. But before we kind of start, I just have to say thank you to Sue Billington. She's been an absolute star. This is her space. She's been very, very busy today. She's been holding a class. She kind of stopped that and then came and we pulled all this together. But we felt this was a very different space to what we normally have up at the Stanton Hall in Cheltenham King in Church Peace. We wanted to do this a little bit differently. So thank you again, Sue. So I'm going to introduce our panel, but I just want to kind of set the scene. And I'm going to read this because usually I don't. For those of you who know me well, I don't actually read an awful lot. I tend to just ad-lib. But when this idea was still an idea, someone said to me, "You're taking a risk." And the risk was that COP26 would not be a success. So how could you hold something like this if it isn't a success? And they weren't wrong to ask. But something inside said, actually, this is too important an opportunity to miss. We have 3 people here, all in local residents, all had the opportunity to go to what is called the Greatest Climate Conference, and to bring that back from Glasgow to Cheltenham Kings and to share that with us. So it's making it real for people who couldn't attend. We only pick stuff up from media outlets. We pick it up from our phones, from the second-hand, whichever we follow, The Guardian, The Times, The Mirror, whatever, it's all kind of like somebody else's story. So this is today, hopefully you'll get an opportunity to ask your questions. I actually believe there's a bigger risk here, which is complacency. And the hope that, we will get this in time to make a difference. This is the moment, this is, our time, and so hopefully, what I'd say this evening is make the most of our time in here. So, you will notice, it's now been switched off, but we had David Attenborough in his opening speech running over here with COP26. You will also see around the room these little posters. These were some of the commitments made at COP26. And again, it's just bringing it into the room. We also have a couple of statements, one from Patrick Vallance, one from David Attenborough. They're well worth having a look at when you get a minute before you go. And also, actually, really importantly, for those of you who noticed as you came in, at the back here is a fantastic piece of work. It was a few people, Miriam, Lorraine, Annie, and a few others, were prepared to stand for 2 weeks on Cheltenham Promenade. I'm sure there was others, there just happened to be people I know, for 2 weeks, despite the weather, the whole period of COP, just talking to people, just engaging with them about what this was all about and holding what they call the silent vigil. But actually what amused me was that, as Annie said in her interview on BBC Radio Gloucester, it wasn't very silent, there was an awful lot of talking. But I think what was important was that people were asked to write on one of these footprints, and some people wrote, some people embroidered, some people did all sorts of things. These will then, we were very fortunate, they've given them to us, as some of them are. They're going to pull them together, and some much cleverer people than me are going to sew them together and make it into a bigger piece of art, and this will then be used at other events. We're seeing it in its raw state because it's so kind of new, and I think ultimately it will be presented to the Borough Council. So, you know, well done to them for doing that. Okay, so on to what you actually came for. I will introduce our panel. First of all, Isabella Kaminsky. She's a journalist who's been writing about the environment and climate change for the past 13 years, specialises in climate justice and litigation, and was recently in Glasgow to report on COP26 climate talks for the ENDS report and ENDS Europe. Have I said it right? Thank you. It's great. They sat in the order I wrote this in. Fantastic. Patricia Thornley is a Fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering with 28 years' experience working on energy projects in industry and academia. She's Director of Energy and Bioproducts Research Institute at Aston University and has been a Director of UK's Supergen Bioenergy Hub since 2012, with a responsibility for coordinating research into bioenergy and strategically guiding its membership to focus on sustainable bioenergy and biofuel development. And finally, Raechel. Raechel Kelly is a freelance sustainability consultant with 13 years' experience in sustainable finance. She works with local businesses, schools and charities on climate and becoming regenerative organisations, and she currently runs Planet Cheltenham project with the local charity Vision 21, which involves running the youth climate group for 16 to 24-year-olds. I'm going to say thank you before we start. I know you've all kind of rushed here. Rachel's just been in a meeting with her 16 to 24-year-olds in St Paul's and finished at 7:10 so she could get here for 7:30. And I know that Patricia has had a heck of a day, and she will no doubt share that with us as well. So, and I'm not doubting that Isabella hasn't had a day of it as well. So, I will ask a few introductory questions just to warm up the room, and then I'm going to open it up to yourselves. And these are going to say quite basic, but I think they're quite important. This is for Isabella really. So, what was COP26 and why was it important?
Oh, okay.
Go on. What is it? You set the scene for us.
So essentially, the UN more than 26 years ago actually, agreed to come together and acknowledge climate change as one of the sort of big threats to humanity, and to come up with a kind of international framework for working towards doing something about it. And that was back in 92, I think it was. And since then, almost every year, all the countries who party to this, which is essentially every country in the world, have met somewhere and agreed how they're going to act to cut their emissions. I say almost every year because there have been a couple of gaps, and obviously Glasgow was meant to happen last year, but didn't because of the pandemic. And so this is the sort of 26th international meeting, and it builds on what's happened before. The sort of important stage that happened in between was, the most important bit was probably in 2015, when all the international leaders met in Paris and came up with the Paris Agreement. And that was the landmark deal that climate change really was an imminent threat and that every country had a responsibility for doing something about it. And all the COPs that have happened since then have built on that and have been, how are we actually going to do that? And so this particular COP was really important because it was coming up with some of the rules about how that was going to happen, and some of those are really quite technical, boring rules, but really important. How we're going to trade carbon, how a country is going to report on its emissions to the UN, so that they're all doing it in the same way and they are transparent about it. And some of it was about kind of taking a step back and saying, okay, everything that every country has promised to do up to now, like, does that take us to a safe level of global warming? And going into the agreement, there was a stock take of everything that every country had promised. So every country has to put forward its own pledge of how it's going to cut its emissions. That's a voluntary thing, and they decide how they're going to do that. You can agree that that's a good or a bad thing, but that's how it works. And the stock take of all those countries' promises showed that we fall short of the aim, which is essentially 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial conditions. And so part of the effort of this COP was to try and put pressure on countries to each be a little bit more ambitious to get us a little bit closer to that goal. Yeah, and that was the sort of, those are the key aims of the Glasgow meetup.
Thank you. Thank you for setting us out. So, Raechel, you know, what were your first impressions when you arrived?
Well, I love Glasgow, so it was nice to be back in Glasgow. And I especially enjoyed all the Americans calling it Glasgow. But yeah, for me, there was a really, really stark difference between what was happening like on the fringe and in Glasgow centre and like outskirts sort of as a whole and in communities and stuff. And then going, so I didn't have a blue zone pass, I was in a green zone. So blue zone is like if you're a diplomat or press, then you have a badge and you can go into the blue zone. The green zone is like the kind of public interaction bit. So I did have a green zone pass, so I went in there. But what was really marked for me, which I don't know if you both found, was like there was lots of kind of exciting stuff happening in and around the conference, and lots of like fringe events and community group stuff. And then you had to kind of get either on a bus or like walk across the bridge into this really sterile like industrial wasteland and walk for miles and miles and miles, and then walk through, so the green zone you had to like walk through a car park and then like go through security to get like inside. And yeah, it was just very weird to go from like this really incredibly uplifting, all of the stuff that was happening in Glasgow. There was like Indigenous activists, youth activists everywhere, all these art projects, the Moth to a Flame at the Botanic Gardens, which I went along to, and it was all just really bursting with energy and activism, and I found it really uplifting and energising. And then you're in the middle of an industrial estate in Ibrox and Govan going, oh, okay, this is a bit different. And the green zone especially was there was some great stuff. I had a lovely chat with one of the days that I was in there, the WI had a stall. And they embroidered all of this, and it was fantastic. I had such a good chat with their team who were there, who were running this ambassadors project across the UK, really, really interesting. And I went to a brilliant youth event, but other than that, it was quite corporate and quite sterile. So that was probably one of my first impressions of inside that bit. But yeah, I don't know what you guys thought.
Well, yeah, I will ask you both then. Patricia, what was
my
yours?
first, so we came up on the sleeper train and arrived into Glasgow at the crack of dawn, and the first thought was, wow, it's great to be back in Glasgow. Yeah. Isn't it a wonderful place? How lovely are all these people? But it was the level of organisation, because you went out of Glasgow station, down the steps, there was the electric bus waiting, there were all the people ready going, you looking for COP? It's this way, there you go, you wait on the bus. And it was, you know, the level of organisation was like it had been at the Olympics. There were volunteers everywhere, there were wonderful people. Yeah. And everybody on the bus was talking to each other. How nice is that, you know? And everybody's all, where are you from? Why are you here? Now, the green zone, I do agree, was a bit sterile, but I have to say, I'd heard complaints about, you know, the security. Yeah, it was airport-style security, but it was a dollar to get through. Yeah. It was absolutely fine. A lot of the problems have been overrated.
Yeah, my friend who I went in with had a butter knife in her bag. And then they were like, you've got a knife in your bag, and she was like, oh yeah, I do have a knife in my bag. And so they confiscated it off her, and she said, oh, do you want us to throw it away? And she was like, no, I'll come and get it again at the end. We walked and I was like, why have you got a butter knife in your bag? She was like, you never know when you might have a picnic. So I'm just imagining there's a whole tin of butter knives just waiting.
My spork
you had a
confiscated.
spork, yeah.
I had to go go to UN security to get it at the end. And I have my support there.
So security was there for a really good reason. There was a lot of women with picnic tools.
So that's what you're going to take away from this, that you've got people who go on with picnic tours.
No, it was stunningly well organised. I'm going to give credit where it's due. I thought it was really
The
well
electric
organised.
buses were great.
The electric buses were great, and the signposting and all that stuff was fabulous. And the kids who were attending, the school kids, there were hordes of school kids came in every morning to the Green Zone, and they seemed to really enjoy it.
Yeah.
I agree that I thought it was a bit dry, and frankly, that was down to the last minute organisation,
Yeah.
because those of us who were applying for stands in the Green Zone, and I think I was involved in about 5 or 6 different applications, were left, frankly, to the last minute and given practically no information on what we could take up or what was happening. So that's what happens if you don't communicate and don't engage. You end up with something sterile.
Patricia, so obviously, based on your area of interest, was it what you were hoping for?
Do you mean
I'm
the activities in Glasgow, or do you mean the outcome of the whole declaration?
I'll go with the activities for now.
The activities for now, yes, I really enjoyed it. We had a wonderful time engaging with people. So we said, you know, I'm a director of a research institute, but we were actually with 6 different groups. So there are 6 programs in the UK that between them cover all of renewables. There's offshore wind, there's solar, there's all of them. And we had all banded together, and we were up there trying to do communications with a wide range of people about what the UK's research is doing on renewables and how close all of this is to reality, and what the environmental pros and cons are of different stuff, and how it all fits together to do net zero. And yes, we were totally delighted with all the people we engaged with. It was a lot better than going to an international conference, because they'd all come to us. It was wonderful, with people from all over the world, as Raechel was saying, and from all different walks of life. But one of the main things I was up there for was running what I was just describing earlier, a fishbowl. A fishbowl is where you take a small set of people who have different views on a subject, and you ask them what they think about different topics. But you have a room like this, and it was not far off this size. We had about 40. And at any point, there's always a spare chair. And at any point in time, anyone who's watching, who now thinks they understand what's being said and has their own opinion on it, can come and take a place. And they come and take a place, and as soon as the spare seat is taken, one other person must leave. So you go round in a circle like that, and it's a really interesting way of having a conversation. I mean, we're having a conversation now, and later on there'll be questions, but it's not quite the same as having one of you come up here and tell us what you actually think, and tell all the other people in this room what you think. So that was the main thing that I was doing. I was running that in the first week on behalf of the UK energy research community. And then I had a totally different experience the second week, but maybe we'll leave that for later, because the second week I was with the corporates, the bad boys, and ended up in the middle of some of the very interesting protests, which was fascinating.
Oh, well, we're going to come to protests at a slightly later date. What about yourself, Isabella? Was it what you were hoping for? And again, not necessarily from a COP perspective, but you know, what you know, as a journalist.
It's sort of hard to separate those two things, right? But given my job is just to go there and report on what's happening, yeah, I mean, it was a good experience in that sense. It's not just about sort of those negotiations, it's a focus point for everybody in climate, essentially, to go to Glasgow. So it's like the ultimate climate conference. So it's an opportunity to meet everybody that, you know, you've been speaking to for years on, you know, by phone or on Zoom, and to actually meet them in person. So it's a massive networking opportunity as well. It's not just negotiations. And I think for activists as well, it's a really big space to meet and connect and develop new kind of ideas and new networks. That's really important too. So it's focus point for much bigger action than just the talks.
So thank you for kind of setting the scene for us. So I'm now going to open it up to the room really. Is anybody got any questions that they'd like to, you've obviously come here, is there anything you'd like to ask? As I say, I've kind of set the scene, so anything that's, I did read that the biggest lobbying groups were the fossil fuel industry, and that everyone that was being lobbied was completely overpowered by the fossil fuel industry.
they're actually allowed, well, perhaps they should be allowed in, but allowed to be there in such numbers and lobby everybody. And well, you're all on, so I think that's true then.
I think there was 500 passes, was it? I think 500 passes to fossil fuel companies or associated lobbyists. So they were there in force.
The UK presidency had made quite a big deal of the fact that they were going to be restricting who could sponsor the event, because obviously it's expensive, and they had companies who could sponsor and put their branding everywhere. And they had said that companies whose business models don't align with net zero wouldn't be allowed. And in the end, that essentially excluded fossil fuel companies. So there was this sense that they wouldn't be really visible at it. But then somebody did the maths and actually worked out how many passes had been given, and actually there was a huge delegation of fossil fuel companies.
It's also difficult to separate the two, because I think, you know, the fossil fuel companies are, some of them, looking for other opportunities. So if you look at the likes of Shell and BP, I'm working with both of them at the moment on the renewable side, because they have some money-making activities in renewables as well, so that they're into green hydrogen. So that's why I'm working with one of them, and the other one's into supposedly sustainable aviation fuel. So, you know, I think that they were there as fossil fuel companies, yes, but part of the justification was around what they're doing in renewables. And arguably, I'm just going to go out on a limb here a little bit, I've been working in this sector for a very long time, and one of the real challenges that many of the renewables companies have are that they're actually quite small. And many of them are growing and evolving in a very big marketplace that is dominated by the big corporates. And there is an argument, I'm not saying I agree with it, but there is an argument that if we actually want to deploy however many hundreds of megawatts of wind turbines, we need big companies with big pockets who can get finance to do that. And therefore, you know, if BP Wind or whatever is going to, or BP Solar is going to sort that out, is that a good thing?
Well, it depends, because if you go the one way you go, if you bring in the corporations and you start bringing the big corporations in, that's what's one of the big drivers for getting us where we are now, isn't it? Profit above anything else. And that's all they'll do. They'll make the wind turbines that are materials that aren't recyclable, or maybe not really net zero, and we'll never find out until it's too late that they've actually done that. So it would be nice if I guess governments could invest in companies that were guaranteeing that we wouldn't be burying wind turbines in the ground until we can find a way to actually recycle the blade and things. But they should be included, but I'm not sure, to be honest. I just don't trust them.
I wouldn't disagree with you, but you know, and I get involved with some of the stuff that you've described with the recycling of wind turbines. That is the sort of stuff that we do, but it's really hard to exclude people, and they'll find a way around it. You know, you'll end up with a separate company being formed which will do this instead, but really be on payroll. It's hard.
Yeah.
I would respectfully disagree with you, because I think it's quite easy to exclude people, because there are a lot of people who were excluded from the conversation. You know, a lot of activists and campaigners and people with other backgrounds, whereas the fossil fuel industry is not treated that way. So I think the exclusion can absolutely happen if it's wanted, and I would argue that those voices are disproportionately heard, both formally and informally. So I disagree with you.
Did you feel that you were actually talking to the people that made the decisions and actually drafted this whole thing, or were you just talking to people that had the same views as yourself?
Raechel?
I was definitely talking to people who had the same views as me, because it was, for me, it was all about talking to other people who were involved in community climate action, which is obviously what I'm trying to do with Planet Cheltenham here in Cheltenham. And then, just a lot of people, who agree with me. So, you could argue that perhaps it would have been good to talk to other people, but as Isabella said, it was definitely a case of kind of meeting up with people who are all working together towards the same aim. So that was sort of one of the main draws for me, and and also like youth activists, you know, from around the world. So one of the events I was at, they had a youth activist from Bangladesh, a youth activist from Nepal, from Finland, and one from Canada. And it was just incredible to hear their stories about their activism in their country and what they are allowed to do and what they aren't allowed to do, and their process of getting to the UK and how they've done that. And I think I do agree with Isabella. I think that there was a lot of exclusion that happened. I think a lot of it was sort of done under the cover of COVID. I don't think that was necessarily always true. So Isabella will correct me if I'm wrong, but usually how it works is you have observers in the discussions, in the plenary sessions. So those official observers would be sort of from NGOs or charities, who, you know, makes it more transparent if they're in the room while the other discussions are happening. And there was a really big issue with them not issuing very many observer passes, or them having to be shared across. So like 5 NGOs were sharing like 1 observer pass, so obviously that means you're limited as to who can go to what, and a lot of the rooms that the discussions were happening in, you know, there'd be sort of restrictions on how many people could be in there, so the observers would be sort of like last on the list to get in, and my understanding of what happens is the official discussions happen, and then if there's sort of space or time at the end, the observers can add or like speak during that sort of end bit, and obviously that additional level of sort of oversight and bringing other perspectives into the room, I think is really useful as part of the discussions. I know that did happen a bit in a lot of the plenary sessions,
but not as
but not as much
much as in previous
as in previous COPs. That didn't happen. And also there was the example, I don't know if you saw, of the Israeli minister in a wheelchair who couldn't actually access the building on the first day. Obviously that's a very that's a physical access issue, but I think that was definitely a lot of the tone that I heard from especially activists, was like the inclusivity sort of wasn't being prioritised really, and I know a lot of the youth activists as well felt that. So, you know, we talk about greenwashing with companies, like, you know, bigging up what they're doing in sustainability but not walking the talk, and a lot of the youth activists felt that there was a sort of a bit of youth washing with this COP, so they would kind of invite young people into the room or like get them to talk, but it wasn't meaningful dialogue. They didn't really feel that they were necessarily being listened to all the time. So sorry, I've gone into a bit of a cul-de-sac there.
No, not at all.
So the people that were listening, that you refer to them as the observers?
Sorry, the people
that were actually listening to the arguments, well, I think you referred to them as the observers. Were they the people that were drafting the final draft of that?
No, so the observers would be the sort of charities who are just sort of taking in
Watching
what's
and
going on.
scrutinising.
Yeah.
Right.
But there's like 2 tiers, isn't there, of like in the plenaries you have like the host country participant, and then I can't remember the other one. And it's really important which badge you're wearing apparently at the time, because if you say something, it gets like noted in the as part of the discussion.
There are different levels of discussions as well. So there are
Not
some that
accidentally saying
are
anything.
completely open, and they're open for people if they had passes to go in, and they were live streamed. But there are also negotiations that happen behind closed doors for good reasons. You know, these are very sensitive discussions, and the negotiators and later ministers want to have some discussions in private. So there are different levels of openness, but the criticism was that the parts that had been previously more transparent and open and accessible for outside people to come and watch and perhaps comment or just, you know, keep an eye on, weren't as open as they had been in previous years.
What was the reason for that?
I mean, essentially it was a COVID reasoning, that there was less space, they were trying to social distance more, so there was less physical space for people to be in. I think possibly, as Raechel suggests, that was used slightly as a cover to not allow so much. I'm not sure what, you know, but essentially it was a COVID reason.
Can I ask a related question? I agree with the gentleman there about fossil fuel representatives. I'm sure we all would. On the other hand, one could argue that power, and those that have power would be the fossil fuel companies to some extent. So my question is, I don't know whether you're able to answer it even, but to what extent do you think that those who make the decisions were people from, let's say, multinational companies, as against people from governments? And was it just the big governments, or did small governments have a say? Do you have any feel for that? Who actually made the decisions in the end, as opposed to your happy discussions?
I think that the voice of small countries was not heard. Pretty happy saying that. The distinction between large countries and big corporates is blurred. You know, I didn't go to the sessions where the negotiations were actually going on. A lot of the drafting actually also have been, a lot of the agreements have been done in advance. I have been involved in a lot of the sessions with people in the UK who've been doing the negotiations prior to this, and what people are prepared to do and what they're prepared to go to is decided in advance, really. It's not thrashed out on the day to the extent that I think it's played out to in media. I think that certainly the position statements are done well in advance, and a lot of what was announced in the first week, most people already knew that was either happening or had been committed to. There wasn't a lot new.
And what about my point about companies versus countries?
I would agree with you that it's a bit blurred, especially when it comes to, Western governments and how much their decisions are driven by business in the So yeah, and I know that the format is as well that countries form sort of blocks and alliances, don't they? So sort of a lot of the smaller nations will kind of join together, won't they?
I mean, the essence of the conference is meant to be between different governments, right? And that all these different 197, right?
Yeah.
Different countries are on equal terms and each are sort of negotiating partners. But obviously in practice that isn't the case. If you're a small country, you don't wield the same political power. You don't physically bring the same number of people to the negotiations to be able to influence them. And yeah, it's true, companies do hold a lot of sway. But in theory, it is the governments that are meant to be regulating those companies and keeping that power at bay. So to some extent, you sort of have to trust in that system to work.
But they're not going to ultimately sign up to things that are not in the business interests of the nation state.
What do you think of what Peter said about the fact that it's just all greenwash? What were your comments about that? Do you agree with her?
Patricia?
What is all greenwash? The whole agreement, or what was being said by different?
What has been said by different governments.
Define greenwash. It's obviously every government who's going there wants to look good and wants to be seen to be playing this on the right side, but only actually wants to commit to a certain amount that they've got to physically do afterwards. So they're all going to be playing the game of minimising what they commit to while maximising their reputation arising from it. If that's greenwash, then yes, they're all doing it. But sorry, I am cynical. Isn't that human nature, and don't we all do that all the time? Don't we all enter into things to some extent where we're, prepared to go a certain way, and people look for credit for what they're doing? I don't know.
I think a good sort of thing that I read was like, even if we were completely on track for 1.5, even if every country had done absolutely everything that it needed to do to be on track for 1.5, COP would have still happened in Glasgow, and the next one would still happen, and the one after that would still happen, because the whole idea is that it's basically like it's keeping track, isn't it? It's like, where are we at, what needs to be done. So even if absolutely everybody was on the same page and we were at 1.5 and we didn't have to worry about it anymore, the COP process would still be happening. So I thought that was quite an interesting way to think about it, is that is part of the mechanism of the COP process. And then going back a bit to your point before, so one of the negotiators who they call Sherpas, which I love, so they're literally helping the countries up the mountain. So there's like 197 countries all coming with their own agenda, and he was basically saying it's like 197 friends deciding where to go for dinner. Where would you even start doing that? But then actually I think a better analogy is like 197 friends going for dinner, but like 5 of them own all the restaurants in town. Some of them have allergies, like there's like a lot of other stuff going on. There's like the power dynamic of the group and everything else. So yeah, I just thought that was quite an interesting. I'm always looking for like the really simple ways of understanding it, not just for me. I pretend it's for the youth group, it's actually for me.
Do you think it would have worked better if there'd been smaller groups, you know, smaller COPs? And I always think that the them and us, you know, indigenous groups, indigenous areas that are suffering now, they can't wait next year or the year after it's happened. And yet we're sort of, oh well, we'll probably consider doing this, that and the other. So,
There was
but how do you think they came out of it?
Well, there were some really, really powerful speeches from nation states who were saying, you've sentenced us to death. Because I think so technically I think the NDC, so the pledges that the countries make, take us to like 1.9, I think, or 2.4. Oh, yeah, but the whole picture is 2.4.
So last week, an expert group calculated that all the promises that each country had made would bring us to 2.4 degrees of warming. Even 1.5 degrees would be catastrophic for a lot of countries. 2.4 is really off the scale, and that's just what countries have promised to do, which, to be frank, a lot of them are not going to do. So we're on track for probably significantly more than that. I vacillate between this, is it greenwash or not? I don't think it's greenwash. I'm heartened by the fact that countries care enough about the issue now and think it's serious enough to at least try and present themselves in their best light. Because not that long ago they weren't even trying. It didn't matter what people thought about them, what they were doing to try and cut their emissions. They do care now, and they're quibbling over wording because it matters. Because it matters internationally, sort of in terms of their reputation. It matters in their country because their people are pressuring them, because they might be pressured in the courts and through other avenues. It really does matter. It's overblown in the sense that we're a long way from where we need to be, but every time all those countries do come together, and it is a really, really complicated endeavour to get people to agree with that, things do get incrementally better. They do agree things. The targets get tougher. There is an improvement each time, but it's holding them to the promises they've made and making sure that does happen. So I think greenwash is too strong a word kind of broadly. I think a lot of people do genuinely care, but it's not achieved everything it's meant to achieve.
I think we talked a lot about the sort of process and what it was like up there, but in terms of what was actually agreed, I think my biggest disappointment was what was agreed in terms of support for the global south. I spent a lot of my time working in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, and we're working with communities there where we're long past the concept of mitigation. We are actively adapting. We're trying to do stuff on the ground there, and it's incredibly frustrating to be doing that year in, year out, and then to have these big sort of events and to see what happens, and then to see how dismissive we are of the needs of others. And the UK and other countries have pushed back the date by which they are going to meet the, whatever it was, 0.7% GDP. There's no sign that I see at the moment that the UK government is moving in the right direction in terms of addressing what happened at the comprehensive spending review, where it further sort of extended the period where we were going to not make our commitments on aid. And one of the things that has happened over the last few years is there has been a sort of merging of the aid budget and the climate finance, and I think that we're not living up to our responsibilities or our commitments, and I say that from a UK perspective, but I say that from a general Northern Hemisphere perspective as well. It is falling way, way short of where it needs to be, and when you go to those places and you work with groups in those countries and you see what people are living with, and the sense of guilt is incredible.
So that sense of guilt, it's very important.
I think there was a question at the back.
Sorry. Yes.
I was just wondering what impact the aid situation had with countries like India and China, who are obviously big contributors, but also are they within that sphere where they need support as well?
So India still qualifies, the UK government still gives support to China in some mechanisms. I think one of the other big surprises for me actually was that Chinese-USA agreement near the end, which was quite fascinating. But, so I said I lead research work. I have literally just this week been asked over the next 6 months to put a plan together for collaboration with India for the next 4 to 5 years. And I've got to have that ready by the end of March. So we, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are the ones who are the emerging economies. And I actually think they are, I hate the way people always finger China and India because of their large populations and say that they are the problem. But actually, if we don't pay attention and support there, we will end up in such a huge mess, it will be unreal. Because if you look at the disparity in carbon intensity per person between China and the China and the US is an order of magnitude. So we cannot afford, as a planet, for everyone in China and India to have the lifestyle of the US. That just cannot happen. And yet we appear to be not doing anything about it. And I know we have all these systems, we have all these regulations and numbers, but it doesn't feel to me like we're paying adequate attention to how we support other countries in sensible pathways.
Also the fact that we've basically outsourced all of our manufacturing to China and India, so we just go, no, those aren't our emissions anymore, that's that guy over there, and actually it's all of our stuff that we're shipping here that isn't even accounted for, is it, in the UK's sort of stock take of their carbon footprint and stuff. We don't even count everything that gets made in China and brought here, so not only are their per capita emissions so much lower, but also it's all of our stuff that's getting made there that's causing those emissions there. And also the historical emissions that, we arguably have, there's more on us and America to do something about that, when actually if you look at the kind of total historic emissions, like you say, it's not really fair to just go, why should we do anything, because look at China, that's not really an accurate picture.
China is carrying out on the research front, China is spending vastly more on research than the US are.
Interesting.
However, was your question sort of asking whether those countries are getting it at the expense of poorer countries? Was that sort of...
No, I was kind of thinking, are we missing a trick by not supporting them, I suppose?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of, obviously there was the story about the last minute changes to the tax, and I think it was both China and India who were
pushed by India primarily.
And it kind of feels like there's room for negotiation and support in exchange for like them being, more active, I guess, and more
although I would add that a lot of quite more vulnerable and poorer countries are also frustrated that they really are getting almost nothing. And so the finance that Patricia was talking about was a few years ago, the wealthier countries promised to set up a £100 billion a year fund, which never materialised, and now it might materialise in a couple of years. But even then, it's a patchwork of not just grants, it's loans with high interest and all kinds of things. So the general support that was promised to help poorer countries adapt is just way shorter than it needs to be. And that's not even talking about loss and damage.
Yeah.
So, but we're talking a lot about mitigation, so how countries can cut their emissions, but countries that are already suffering impacts or going to, they need to start adapting. But actually some of them are already experiencing losses and damages, loss of life and property. They might not even be able to live where they're living anymore, and they rightly want some money to compensate for that. And that's just not even on the table. And there was a lot of push this time to try and set up some sort of funding facility, but the wealthier countries just are absolutely not having it.
Do you think there's enough pressure now that it will happen soon?
Sorry?
Do you think there's enough pressure now that it will happen soon?
No. There was more pressure at this COP than there's ever been, and all they agreed was to fund a facility for helping them with technical assistance if there's a massive disaster. That they're essentially scared of liability, that if they start admitting fault, that they're going to be opened up to this wave of litigation. Although Scotland did promise some money, that was the first country that's ever done so. So maybe there was scope, but it's probably not going to happen.
Although COP is about what the governments negotiate and decide between themselves, that they do on or what they promise on our behalf, did you come away from any informal discussions or any set pieces that could speak to us about what we can do as individuals? Did you come away with any sense of what ordinary people can do?
Yes. I went to one especially good event, but they were giving out free whiskey. So I'm not entirely sure whether it was as good as I remember it being, because I don't really remember the end of it that well. There was also bagpipes. That was a really great session. So that was the idea of the session was to talk about the concept of Fridays for Future, which is the kind of schools, the youth movement of school strikes on Fridays and stuff. But it was Jojo Mehta who runs Ecocide International. So that's a global movement now which is aiming to get ecocide recognised in international law. So in the same way that genocide, and that basically if you trash the earth, there's actually a crime that you can be prosecuted for at the International Criminal Court, which is really a very cool concept and really interesting. And she had sort of convened it, and it was with there was a guy who was brilliant. He was from the Royal Geographical Society of Scotland, and then a bunch of there was a guy who had been one of Obama's climate advisors, and then some kind of youth activists, indigenous activists as well. And the concept was, what if everybody did Fridays for Future? So not as in we all go on strike every Friday, but what if like every Friday afternoon, no matter if you're working at corporate or if you're in a university or wherever you are, whatever you're doing, your Friday afternoon is set aside for solutions. So whether that's in a business setting, you kind of use the Friday afternoon to figure out your strategy around net zero, to basically like give dedicated time to solutions and stuff. And I just thought the discussion was electric, like the ideas that were flying around about what people could do with a Friday afternoon if they were given a Friday afternoon to solely focus on, because it's, yes, it's climate crisis, but actually what we're talking about is loads of other stuff around systems change and equality and rights and all kinds of other things. So what they were talking about was like, why, there's this idea that goes around about a 4-day week. So, if we switch to a 4-day week, that's really good in terms of energy efficiency and everything else that offices are trying to achieve and cut. But actually, what if we turned that on its head and said, okay, well, but a Friday afternoon is going to be solutions focused, and that was incredible. And I do think that would be my main takeaway in terms of your question about sort of individual action. And I've spent since I got back all of the second week and then this week going into schools mainly, and I did an event with Cheltenham Educational Partnership, which is called Changemakers. So that's empowering young people in schools to kind of take action on climate, and that's been pretty tough after like last weekend's announcements and stuff, to go into schools and chat to kids about what's happening, because you have to be honest, and that's been really difficult this last week, including the 9-year-old girl who said to me, is it definite that we're going to fix it? And actually that's a really difficult question to answer truthfully and honestly, without getting really upset, which I managed to not cry when she asked me that. But I just said, no, it's not definite, and that's why your voice matters so much, that, you know, we are all pushing together for the change that we need to see, and, you know, these are some things that we can do. But there are so many good examples, I think, of that theory, that you're never too small to make a difference. And especially if we turbocharge all of that individual action into community level action, which is obviously the space that I work in, so I would say that. But that's where we really have power, is in that community level stuff, where you're not on your own trying to save the world, because that's never going to happen. Actually, we're working at that hyper-local level, creating solutions, giving people advice, the stuff that CK Futures has already done. That's where we can really empower people, because a lot of it is around disempowerment. People just don't think that they can, or that they can make a difference. So actually flipping the script on that and saying that all of us matter, we all need to come together to do something on it, that's got a lot of power in it. So yeah, individual action, CK Futures and Planet Cheltenham comes for us.
So I think that's, you know, I think behind you somewhere there is the quote that from the speech that Patrick Thornley made up there, and what he said was that actually we need the same response as we had to COVID, that it has to be a combination of technology and individual action in order to, you must have the two together if we're going to get anywhere with this. So.
It's a great question. I don't know, Isabella, do you want to answer it as well? You feel?
I might be extrapolating here, but I go to a lot of talks and somebody always asks that. And I get the impression that people want sort of particular concrete changes they can make in their lives. But I'm going to channel Greta Thunberg, who has been asked this question about 1 million times and refuses to answer it anymore. And her answer is, you all know the things you need to do. You all know you need to eat locally and stop driving and stop flying. And you all know the kind of concrete things you need to do in your lives. That the things that are really powerful are using your political power to change things, to pester your elected representatives, to not just to act, but to give them a license to act. Because I think a lot of the reason they don't act is because they think there's going to be pushback from the public. And I think using your political voice in that way is the most powerful thing you can do. And just talking to people about it at the dinner table, it kills conversation, absolutely stone dead. But I think there is no more important thing to be talking about. So I kind of make a point and sort of ask my friends to do it as well. But just talking about it, I think makes a big difference, and that's one of the ways that you can kind of galvanise bigger action and not just be doing your own little siloed thing. I think your political power is the biggest, especially all of us here have greater political power than a lot of other people, and I think it needs to be real. Patricia, what do you
I think I answered.
No, that's fine. No, because I think that's a really important question. I picked up something else that Raechel had said in the week, I think, and it was about communities, but it was about the power of a community if we can even take it down by 0.1, I think you said.
Yeah, so the whole, you know, and a lot of the focus is around 1.5 and 2 and what that looks like. But I think this whole idea that it's sort of success or failure. Like 1.5 is success and 1.5.1 or whatever is failure. Actually, every 0.01 degree is lives saved, is ecosystems saved. So absolutely everything that we do matters. It's never a case of like, it doesn't matter because it's not, we'll sail past 1.5. It does matter. It matters to every degree that we sail past it. So, yeah.
And I think the urgency is important in that context as well, because if you're going to make a change, the sooner you make it, the bigger the impact is on the temperature. And it's, yeah. And I think, I guess for me, this was my first time actually physically being at a COP meeting. And to be honest, it struck me as, I knew it was a big circus around, you know, the main sort of events, but even that, after having spent, you know, a year and a half doing Zoom meetings and all the rest of it, I was sitting there thinking, did we really have to have all these people coming here? Did we have to ruin the lives of the Glaswegians in this way? It was just, you know, it did feel like an awful lot of upheaval when I look now at what we actually signed up to. You know, maybe I'm missing the point of it. It was, don't get me wrong, I loved being up there, do love Glasgow, and it was a really lovely atmosphere, and I spoke to so many people who really inspired me and all of that, but I'm not sure we would have came out with anything very different if we hadn't physically gathered there, I'm sorry.
So, question for me though then is, but by the very doing of it, did it push it up the agenda? And is it just because we're living in the UK and it was in Glasgow and therefore it pushed it up our agenda, or did it push it up the world agenda because we did it? And I'm not saying that, you know, about the outcome, I'm just saying the doing.
I think the publicity spin-off was huge. Like Raechel, I've been doing loads of school assemblies and outreach stuff around it, and I think that we wouldn't have been doing that if it hadn't been so high up. I work at a university and all the universities are on this because their students are interested. So I think that, you know, it allowed us to raise the profile of that. I'm sitting here tonight, I'm supposed to be at a screening of Paris to Pittsburgh on the Cheltenham building, which I was supposed to be talking to them afterwards, but I stayed with you guys instead. You know, so those sort of things are happening in a way that they wouldn't have been happening had this not been taking place in the UK at this point in time. If this was taking place in Paris, would our Students' Union have got involved? Probably not. So I think it did make a difference that it was in the UK this time. And I think it has massively upped the ante, but I think, you know, having champions like Attenborough helped that as well.
So I'm going to tell you a story about the Paris to Pittsburgh, because I was fortunate enough to see this about 2.5 years ago, the film, and I hadn't seen it, and it was extremely powerful. It's about ordinary people in America particularly taking action, because you don't think that people in America did. And as a result, I came out of that thinking, I'm sure if children in Cheltenham could talk to their counterparts in other countries, they would actually have a different conversation than we do at political level. And as a result, we now have, because of the Twinning Association, and I, particularly Angie Boys and a number of others, has helped us to actually connect Balkaras with Sochi in Russia. And so they're now talking to children in Russia about what they're doing. And actually, very interestingly, those children in Russia are probably further ahead than we are. So, you know, it's interesting. They came in on their school holidays to work with our kids. They speak English, and they are, you know, these are 12, 13-year-olds, and they were monitoring, you know, carbon dioxide levels, air quality, etc. Fantastic. And it's a great thing for our young people to actually realise. And we're doing the same with Pates, and we're linking them with Annecy, hoping to do the same with Göttingen in Germany, and linking them with Cheltenham or Bournemouth. But the idea being that came from that film. So all I'm saying is there are sometimes small things that trigger other things. I don't know if any of those children will ever really, you know, think, wow, I talked to somebody from Russia and I've got something from it. But if we've broken down some barriers, that's really powerful stuff. So I'm sorry you're missing it, but it's...
it was you who recommended it
yes,
as well.
It was me
and
that
I said,
recommended
oh, apparently this one's good too, because I wanted to do the climate assembly one, but yeah.
But
big
it's
pictures.
interesting how those small things can lead to bigger things, and that's what we've got to work with.
Well, I think the last time we did this with the Students' Union, actually, there's a group, women in engineering, science and technology within the Students' Union, and what they did as a result of that was they actually got involved with a project that's going on in Nigeria, where they are working with people there, and I'm going to have to try very hard to remember the detail of what they're doing, which I can't at the moment, but it's about, you know, sort of energy and environment and looking at the impacts on the lives of their counterparts, female students in Nigeria compared to here, and they wouldn't have done that had they not. So that understanding has improved massively as a result. Will that reduce our carbon emissions? I don't know.
But you know, I mean, so I'm not trying to sell this up. I'm not trying to say this is all sorted by any means. But I think back to that kind of individual actions and what we can do. There are things that we can do. And Isabella talked to me about political action, absolutely. And I go back to what our friends did, you know, standing for two weeks on Cheltenham Promenade, getting people to sign up and to do this. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to talk to some of the people from the churches locally who want to do things. I think there's definitely something there. It's harnessing it, it's making it work. And will it make a difference? I have no idea whether it'll make a difference. But I think what we've, you know, and I'll ask a couple more questions about COP, and I'll leave it open to the room. But I don't want us all going away thinking, gosh, this is the end. I think actually the future sits with all of us. I think that's what we you know, this is well, I say it's the beginning of something. I just want to ask a question about the protests, because you know they were, I think I read something like 40,000 attendees and 100,000 protesters. But I don't know. What did you feel those? Did you see them? Were you part of them?
Yeah, I did the Friday one. I did the school kids one on the Friday, and it was great.
Fantastic.
We just all of the young people coming out in droves, and really, like, there was definitely, you know, I did a few of them with my middle daughter, and you know that was pre-COVID times when she wanted to go along to a couple of those, and there was definitely quite a lot of kids there who didn't really understand what climate change was, but they were enjoying Friday afternoon skiving off school. In Glasgow, the level of detail on the signs and stuff, and people who like copied out graphs and like all kinds of just incredible like artistry. And what I absolutely loved about the Friday one was so there was a few of the like unions in Glasgow who had various disputes. I think the rail. I think there'd been some dispute on the trains, and then the refuse workers as well. And some of the like youth activist groups had basically linked up to the unions and said like, come and share the platform. We'll give you like, you can just do a quick speech at the beginning and stuff. And what was brilliant was like watching them come into the square. There's all the kids who are holding all of their like climate signs and stuff, and then there was the people from the Glasgow unions who were holding union banners that were over 100 years old, talking about weekends off and equal pay and all of this stuff that was like 100-year-old fights next to our current fight. And basically that for me was just really, I cried a lot while I was up there, but that was one of the times where I was like, this is it, this is how anything has ever changed, is because citizens decide that a change needs to be made. No other change has ever happened. That's how it happens. So I just felt that was really, really powerful. But I'm a stubborn optimist, so.
Well, now you mentioned it. Do you want to just speak about Laura Robertson?
Oh yes, yeah.
Because yes, Laura was hoping to be here tonight, but she can't.
But she can't be. Yeah. So she. I did a couple of events with her which were around SMEs and net zero agenda, because that's, you know, 99% of UK businesses are actually SMEs, and tend to think of these massive corporations, but actually there's a lot which is just, you know, one or two people in an office somewhere. So the idea being that the more small businesses you can get to net zero, it has a knock-on effect of making it easier for larger corporations to then reach net zero if their supply chain is all at net zero already. And obviously net zero is not zero, we need them to go to net zero and then keep pushing forward into being fully regenerative. But yeah, so she had organised this brilliant display where she'd been folding loads of company logos into hummingbirds and then put them into this big display. So there was, because she's Cheltenham based, there was an awful lot of Cheltenham SME representation up there. And she had me doing all sorts of creative things that I'm not particularly good at, like arranging leaves and all sorts. But yeah, it was good fun.
But there's also some other, there was another thing that Laura did as part of this, and about, I don't know, 3 days in, she suddenly made a big announcement. She gave her life savings to actually planting trees, and that is huge to actually do that. And obviously I was kind of follow on LinkedIn, so I kind of picked up on it and sent a lot of other people. But it was a kind of a powerful statement that it made me go, wow, gosh, would I, can I do that? And it really, and there's all sorts of things around that, but it does make you think, and it makes you, realise how powerful this can be for some people, and maybe it does take big actions, maybe it's small actions, but it's going to take action because or else we're not going to have a good outcome. I don't know if anybody got any other questions. Sorry.
Yes, me again. Sorry. Going away from the individual back to politics on it. Seen from the outside, it seems to me that the two biggest disciplines were climate finance, as you suggested, and also the failure, apparently, the unwillingness of India and China and perhaps Australia to address the coal issue. But there's another third issue which hasn't been mentioned, I haven't heard reported on. I wonder if you've heard about it or had it discussed. And it is the whole question of carbon markets and offsetting, which, I mean, a lot of us don't think had worked, and is a way of the Western developing countries, avoiding their responsibilities, if you like. So I wonder if they comment, but was it discussed at all? Fundamental question of whether it should even be part of policy to get back to where we should be.
I had a sharp intake of breath because I had an hour and a half long meeting on that topic this afternoon. So I can assure you that the aftermath is still being discussed and it's still very much in flux. I think it's really difficult. I'm in principle opposed to the idea of offsetting because it prevents people from doing what's actually needed. Even if we look at what we're doing at the moment and switching to renewables and stuff, and actually we need to reduce demand. That's what we really need to be addressing. And I think offsetting is a rather convenient way, just as Raechel said, that we just buy our stuff from China and India now and let them deal with the emissions and the child labour and all the other issues that go with that. It's the same with offsetting, it's just handing the problem to somebody else because we're rich enough to afford it. So I'm sort of fundamentally opposed to the concept, but, and there is a but, money makes the world go round. And if it can in some way be a mechanism to shift money from the richer parts of the world to the poorer parts of the world, then I'm all for that. I haven't seen much evidence of that so far, but in principle that's what the mechanism should do. And if that can succeed, then let's have that. But I am in principle opposed to it because I think it just offshores our moral obligation.
So in terms of COP in particular, in principle I agree. But one of the big parts of this particular negotiation was absolutely carbon market and how the rules are going to work. So in Madrid, that was basically the big sticking point that sort of didn't work out, and the countries couldn't agree that if they were going to have this international market for how they were going to trade carbon, what would be the rules. And they did. It's been very quiet because it's been overshadowed by other things, but actually they did agree a set of rules. So the idea was that if we are going to have to do it, we need a really strong set of rules to ensure that it works properly, that, for example, a country doesn't count things twice, which was what a lot of countries wanted to do, absolutely balmy, and that if you claim that you're offsetting your emissions by planting something over there, it wasn't just going to be planted anyway. And actually, although I agree that the whole principle is deeply problematic, the rules they agreed are not terrible. That's as optimistic as I get. They're not as nearly as bad as they could have been. There are some safeguards to try and ensure that, that projects really are accounted for properly. So I guess the point is it's probably going to happen anyway. It's already happening voluntarily. So there might as well be really strong rules that ensure it happens as well as possible.
That was the discussion we were having this afternoon, actually, which is the point that, how many people in this room probably have taken flights somewhere and bought a carbon offset at the same time, and that's not even, officially registered and regulated. So if there are people who are willing to do that, then you might as well make the most of them, is one view of the world.
But it's been around for 20 years or more, carbon offsetting. Did any discussion, did any of them say, oh yes, it's worked?
As it is currently, it's deeply problematic. Probably most of the offsets are not genuine offsets. So the idea of this is to agree a set of rules so that they are genuine. Whether that works in practice, we'll see, and whether it does just sort of...
I have seen carbon offsetting projects that have delivered socio-economic benefits to poor people in other countries. I can stand by that, I have physically seen that, but it didn't reduce carbon.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't anyway, does it?
And
it doesn't shift it.
So it's not an offset in that sense. That's my fundamental problem with it. We
the
call it an offset, but it's not.
Is the worry that, a bit like recycling, people go, oh, we can recycle plastic bottles, we'll carry on buying plastic bottles, and actually even buy more plastic bottles.
Yeah.
Is that what's going to happen? We'll buy more because actually it's fine, we can, recycle, which not necessarily.
And, the example of the forests that were planted through offset schemes in California going up in smoke last year because of climate change. So, you're not even, it is the Wild West at the moment, but even with the sort of strict rules, nature has other ideas.
It doesn't negate the need to cut emissions.
Exactly.
Was hydrogen technology discussed much?
In my world, it's non-stop. But there's a few interesting things on hydrogen. In the world of research, we've been talking about it for 20 years. Suddenly it's got picked up and everybody thinks it's the solution. It isn't, it can't be. And everybody's developing, ways of using hydrogen. Oh, we're going to have it in our domestic gas. We're going to fly planes on it. We're going to, actually at COP, JCB were there, and JCB have developed a digger that runs on hydrogen. Excellent. But, I really, really struggle with this because it requires such a massive increase in green electricity that we don't seem to be putting the infrastructure in place for. And the actual infrastructure itself, I work in a chemical engineering department, so the practicalities of hydrogen and what we would do with it just obsess me a little bit. And I don't think we're giving anywhere near the attention that we need to that. But people have for too long just been saying, that's it, it's a bit like the carbon offsetting argument. We'll just take hydrogen, do it with hydrogen, zero emissions. No, it's not zero emissions. There are emissions upstream. If you build an electrolyser, then, you've got to do this. I see people talking about this, for domestic heating, and I'm thinking, sorry, especially the people who are producing this from natural gas, which is just frankly bonkers. I'm going to take natural gas and then I'm going to put lots of energy into it to turn it into hydrogen, by which stage I've actually lopped off 20% of what I had in the first place, and then I'm going to use it, and I'll call it green. That's, just not where we want to be. So hydrogen is no doubt the fuel of the future in that sense if we physically want a fuel, but I think it's deeply problematic that we're not properly accounting for the upstream elements of hydrogen production, and that we have not even thought about how much we've got to do in terms of infrastructure to adapt for that. And let's get some demand reduction. How about that instead?
I'm going to use a scientific term. It's a lot more explodey than gas. gas as well. So there's also there's also that to think about, having it piped into people's homes.
You can tell why Rachel's not in the Keller. I'm going to take one more question and then I'm going to wrap it up. So the gentleman at the back.
Can I ask, was there much talk about using nuclear energy at all?
So that was nuclear energy.
Are we talking about UK context here, or are we talking COP? I don't think there was much said at COP about nuclear,
I didn't hear
but
it
I
mentioned.
think practically every country in the world is assuming they're going to have it. Certainly the UK, all the projections we see for 2050 are assuming that it will be there. It's interesting actually, because I think 20 years ago we were hearing a lot of challenges around nuclear, and I'm not hearing that at the moment. I'm hearing people complaining about a lot of things, but at the moment, you know, we had the announcement, was it last week, on the SMRs, the small reactors. I can't remember how much government's paying, but you know, and there's a good example that, you know, they're actually paying for that. They're subsidising that. Sorry, we thought that you told us that it had to be all market-based and the renewables had to come down in price, but no, not if it's nuclear, that's okay. Sorry, but yeah, it wasn't discussed much at COP. I think everyone's just assuming it's going to be there and it's going to be needed. Last week's announcement sort of backs that up, that government have decided they're prepared to pay for it. What I find entertaining is that I said at the start that my background originally is working on large power stations, and I know how long they take to build and to get planning permission for and to conceive. And the last time we tried to build nuclear reactors in the UK, we were looking at a sort of 10 to 12 year construction period, never mind the planning and all the rest of it. So I think that the time scale for doing that is immense. I don't think we've got skills base in place, and I think we could have interesting times ahead if we're relying on that.
So thank you very much. There was one last question I was going to ask, and actually I'm going to ask you actually. The question I was going to ask our panel was, well, as a result of this, what's one thing you'll do differently? But I think actually more importantly is what one thing that we will all do differently as a result of what has happened and what we've heard tonight. And obviously I'm not going to go around and test you all and ask you each of you, everybody, what is it that you're going to do. But I would like us to all to think, to reflect on what it is. And I'm going to go back to Raechel here again, because there's something she said this week, and it's been bouncing around my head for quite a long time. It's about being a good ancestor, and actually I think it's a really powerful thing to consider. Our role in all this is, could we say we are being good ancestors? So I'm going to leave it there for now. But I just want to say thank you so much. You've taken a bit of a beating, because you took your time and went up to Glasgow, despite all the journey and everything else, and what you experienced there, and to bring it here as well, that's really important, and thank you so much. So thank you very, very much. Just to say, if anybody is interested, there is some things over here where, those of you who want to know, CK Futures is part of the Parish Council. So there's some leaflets there. We have here something that actually the youth ambassadors created, something called the A to Z of Sustainability. It's a brilliant piece of work that they did on our behalf, so thank you. And also the Sustainable Cheltenham Kings is a Facebook group that we have here as well. Got 400 members at the moment. We'd like to have more, so please join that. So anyway, thank you all again, and I say, I'm sure Sue will be happy for you to take something. Sue, is there anything you'd like to say at all? Because you were kind enough to do this. No voice. Well, thank you again for your space. Thank you all.